millionaire CEO, accustomed to running a multi-million-dollar empire, unexpectedly finds himself caught off guard by a late and clumsy bridesmaid at his best friend's wedding. Before we dive into the story, take a moment to leave a comment and let us know where you're watching from. Now, sit back and enjoy the tale. Jessica was in full-on panic mode, hurrying through the lavish hotel hallways with a dress hem held tightly in one hand, desperately trying to avoid the disaster of breaking her ankle in heels that, until now, had seemed like the epitome of elegance, but had quickly become her worst enemy. The plan had been simple: arrive early, help with the wedding preparations, and perform her duties as the bridesmaid with grace and poise. But of course, the universe had other plans for her that day. The taxi she had booked was inexplicably late. Then, just as she arrived at the hotel, a reckless driver came too close for comfort, nearly clipping her as she crossed the entrance. And, as if that wasn't enough, the elevator that was supposed to take her directly to the ballroom was packed with guests, forcing her to hightail it up the stairs, risking both her pride and her footwear. If there were a competition for the most clumsy bridesmaid, she would undoubtedly take home the gold medal. "Sorry, so sorry," she muttered, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she bumped into bewildered guests, all of whom seemed to be oblivious to her frantic rush. She was nearly there, just a few more steps, and she could hear the soft murmur of the guests inside the ballroom. The ceremony was about to begin. She could almost taste the sweet relief of having made it. And then it happened. Bam! In an instant, Jessica collided with something, or rather, someone, solid. The force of the impact sent her bouquet sailing through the air, her purse crashing to the floor, and her body hurtling forward with the terrifying prospect of meeting the hotel's plush carpet face first. But before disaster could strike, a pair of strong hands caught her around the waist, halting her fall and preventing a full-on catastrophe. The rich scent of expensive cologne surrounded her senses, and for a brief moment, she was utterly disoriented. She couldn't even remember her own name as her heart raced. "Pops, please tell me I didn't just knock over an elderly man," she stammered, struggling to regain her balance, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'm definitely not an elderly man," came the low, gravelly voice, slow and measured, causing her to blink in confusion before looking up at the person who had saved her from an even bigger disaster. Jessica's mouth went dry. What kind of genetic injustice was this? Standing before her was a man who looked like he had just stepped out of a high-end fashion magazine. Dark hair perfectly styled, piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her, and an aura of authority that suggested he was used to commanding a room. His face held a mix of curiosity and amusement, as if he found her chaos both bewildering and, dare she say, entertaining. "You're late." Jessica's eyes went wide. "Oh, fantastic!" Not only was he incredibly handsome, but he also had a knack for stating the obvious. "Thank you, Captain Obvious. Any other groundbreaking facts you'd like to share?" she snapped, trying to mask the flush creeping up her neck. The corner of his lips twitched upward slightly, a hint of amusement dancing in his gaze. But Jessica didn't have the time, nor the patience for flirting, especially not with someone whose smirk was ridiculously attractive. She made a move to step away, determined to escape the situation. But then she felt a sudden tug on her dress. Looking down, she saw, to her absolute mortification, that the fabric had gotten caught on her heel. "Oh, fantastic! As if tripping wasn't embarrassing enough, now I'm stuck, too," she muttered under her breath, her frustration mounting. Without any hurry, the man crouched down and, with a smooth motion, freed the fabric from her shoe. "You may now continue your suicide mission," he remarked, his voice dripping with dry humor. "I was already on my way," she shot back quickly, trying to regain her composure. Before she could make a hasty exit, he added with a low chuckle, "I hope you have life insurance, because at this pace, you won't even make it past the buffet." Jessica rolled her eyes at his teasing, but she couldn't help the slight annoyance building within her. She grabbed her things off the floor and, without another glance, took off again, this time not daring to look back. But even in the midst of her panic, his voice lingered in her head, like an echo she couldn't shake. "Don't look at him. Don't look at him." She repeated the words like a mantra as she slipped back into position among the bridesmaids. The ceremony had already begun, and Clara, her best friend and the bride, was glaring at her with all the fury of a volcano on the brink of eruption. Jessica couldn't bring herself to care about the icy look Clara shot her way. Her attention kept drifting to the imposing figure seated among the groomsmen, the man from the hallway collision. He was right there, staring at her with that cool, assessing gaze that sent a strange shiver down her spine. "Who is that?" she whispered to one of the bridesmaids standing beside her. "William Pfizer." Jessica blinked, trying to digest the information. "And why should I know who he is?" "Because he's one of the richest men in the country and the CEO of one of the world's largest financial consulting firms." Jessica's mind raced, trying to process the weight of those words. "Oh, of course," she muttered sarcastically. "Makes perfect sense that a billionaire would spend his time rescuing clumsy bridesmaids in hotel hallways." Her friend stifled a quiet laugh, the kind that only emerged from someone who knew just how awkward the situation was. "He's a mystery, you know," she whispered. "Cold, calculating, and he never lets anyone get close. They say he has the power to end anyone's career with just one phone call." Jessica swallowed hard, feeling a knot form in her stomach. Great. Not only had she nearly run him over, but she had also been rude, something that would undoubtedly leave a mark. The last thing she needed was to make an enemy of someone like William Pfizer, no matter how intimidating or aloof he seemed. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady herself. "All right, focus, Jessica." The wedding was happening, and she was part of it, whether she liked it or not. She just needed to survive the ceremony. No more disasters, no more embarrassing moments, and, most importantly, stop looking at William Pfizer. But of course, when she opened her eyes again, he was still watching her. His gaze was steady, almost knowing, as if he had an uncanny ability to see right through her. He raised one eyebrow, a silent acknowledgement that he knew exactly what she was thinking. A chill ran down Jessica's spine, and for a moment, it felt like the room had grown colder. Something told her this night was just beginning, and somehow, she was already in deeper than she realized. Jessica was never the type to get easily intimidated. She was confident, self-assured, and had built a career as an architect, one that required her to stand firm in the face of criticism and pressure. But in that moment, sitting among the other bridesmaids, desperately trying to focus on the ceremony, she couldn't ignore the unsettling weight of that gaze on her. William Pfizer. She didn't even need to glance his way to know he was still watching her. It was almost as if his presence alone was a force that could pierce through the noise of the room. The air seemed heavier, charged with an invisible tension. Every time she shifted in her seat, the sensation of his eyes on her intensified, and it was impossible to escape it. The rest of the world, the soft whispers of the guests, the gentle rustling of dresses, seemed to fade away, leaving only that intense, enigmatic gaze. "You've been playing with your hair for 5 minutes." The soft voice of the bridesmaid beside her broke through the haze of her thoughts, and Jessica snapped out of her trance, suddenly aware of the small, nervous habit she had been indulging in. Her hand dropped to her lap, and she felt her face flush with embarrassment. "Have I?" she asked, trying to sound casual but failing miserably. "Yes. And guess what? He's still looking at you," her friend added, a mischievous smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Jessica closed her eyes for a brief second, silently cursing herself. Great. Just what I needed. Her already chaotic day seemed to be getting worse by the second. "Why would a billionaire CEO be interested in staring at me?" she muttered under her breath, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I'm just an architect who almost knocked him over in a hotel hallway." Her friend shrugged nonchalantly, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "Who knows? Maybe he likes a challenge," she said with a teasing lilt. Jessica sighed deeply and tried to refocus on the ceremony unfolding before her. But even as the bride and groom exchanged their vows and the guests let out soft, sentimental sighs, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The weight of his gaze, piercing, unrelenting, was still there, lingering, impossible to ignore. The wedding reception was in full swing. The grand ballroom shimmered with golden lights that reflected off the crystal chandeliers, casting a warm, inviting glow. Soft, elegant music filled the air, mingling with the soft chatter of guests as they moved gracefully between tables, all adorned with pristine white linens and delicate floral arrangements. Waiters in crisp uniforms carried trays laden with glasses of champagne, adding to the air of opulence. Jessica did her best to stay focused, keeping an eye on Clara, making sure the bride was taken care of, and most importantly, avoiding any further embarrassing moments. She couldn't afford another disaster, but as always, the universe had different plans for her. As she reached for a glass of wine from a passing waiter's tray, she turned too quickly and collided with something solid. Once again, the dark liquid splashed in every direction. Time seemed to freeze as Jessica watched the disaster unfold in slow motion. The red stain spread across the pristine fabric of a black suit, the contrast stark against the sleek material. Her breath caught in her throat as she looked up in horror and met William Pfeiffer's piercing blue eyes staring back at her, his gaze calm but no less intense. "Tell me this didn't just happen," she whispered, her voice barely audible, still holding the empty glass in her trembling hand. William glanced down at his shirt, then back at her, his expression utterly unreadable. "Well, it did." Jessica swallowed hard, her mind racing to come up with an apology or a solution. I'll grab a napkin. No, wait, I can clean it." Before she could finish, William, with a slow, composed movement, removed his jacket and rolled up his sleeves, as if it were nothing more than a slight inconvenience. "Relax, it's just wine," he said, his voice smooth and calm. Jessica blinked, stunned by his calm demeanor. "You're not going to sue me?" she asked with a nervous laugh. "Or, throw me out of the party?" A slight curve appeared at the corner of his mouth, a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Not yet," he replied, "but if you'd like to make it up to me, you could join me at the bar." Jessica blinked again, unsure if she had heard him right. Was that an invitation? "More like an attempt. Depends on your answer," he added, his eyes holding a trace of amusement. She looked around, her mind desperately searching for an escape, but the truth was, despite everything that had happened, there was something undeniably intriguing about him. Something about the quiet confidence in his voice, the unshakable calm that seemed to surround him, and the way his gaze always seemed to study her with silent interest. Or maybe it was just plain curiosity. "Okay," she said, finally conceding. "But I get to choose the drinks." William gave a small nod toward the bar, his expression unreadable. "Surprise me." The ballroom's bar was undeniably luxurious, yet it felt oddly quiet. Only a handful of guests sat at the counter, their voices soft and conversations sparse, creating an intimate, almost private atmosphere. The dim glow of the lighting bathed the space in a warm golden hue, and the polished wood of the bar gleamed beneath the light. It felt like a hidden retreat from the hustle and bustle of the reception, where time slowed down just enough for Jessica to catch her breath. She settled onto one of the high stools, crossing her arms over her chest, and took in the room. The weight of the evening seemed to lift a little in this quiet corner. Then, her eyes flicked to William as he stood beside her. A playful thought crossed her mind. "I should order something ridiculously expensive just to see your reaction," she teased. William tilted his head slightly, the corner of his mouth quirking upward, but his expression remained mostly unreadable. "You think I'd care about the price of a drink?" "That's exactly why it would be fun," she replied, the hint of a smile tugging at her lips. His chuckle was low and smooth, and Jessica felt a small shiver run down her spine. It was the kind of laugh that was rare, and for some reason, hearing it felt oddly satisfying. William Pfeiffer, the man who was often seen as untouchable, reserved, and in control, was actually capable of laughter. Who knew? The bartender approached, ready to take their order. Without hesitation, Jessica spoke up. "2 shots of whiskey." William raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Impressive," she shrugged, unfazed. "Did you think I'd order a fruit cocktail?" "I think you like to surprise people," he replied, his voice smooth with an undertone of something unreadable. The whiskey arrived quickly, its amber hue shimmering in the dim light. Jessica picked up her glass, holding it for a moment as if contemplating her next move. Then she turned toward William, a small, playful smile curling at the corner of her lips. "So, William Pfeiffer," she began, her voice light yet full of curiosity. "Tell me, why is a high-powered CEO at a wedding that clearly doesn't fit his reserved style?" William swirled his drink, his eyes glinting as he took a moment before responding. "Because I'm the groom's best man." "And because your social life consists of boring corporate events?" she added, her tone teasing. William's laugh came again, and this time it felt like a victory for Jessica. She wasn't sure why, but hearing him laugh made her feel like she'd managed to break through his carefully constructed exterior, just a little. "Maybe, but what about you?" he asked, leaning slightly toward her. "I'm the bridesmaid of honor," she replied with a mock sigh. "Which means I'm here out of duty, not choice." "And yet," he said, studying her with that inscrutable gaze, "you seem to be enjoying yourself." Jessica took a sip of her whiskey, the warmth of the alcohol spreading through her. "Well, the night got a lot more interesting after I spilled wine on the guest of honor and almost knocked him over in the hallway." William smirked, his expression unreadable, yet there was a touch of humor in his eyes. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" "Probably not," she admitted, her voice light, but with an edge of finality. The conversation fell into a comfortable silence, but it wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that felt charged, as if there was something unspoken between them, something lingering in the air, growing slowly. Jessica couldn't quite place it, but it was there, undeniable. She looked away for a moment, pretending to focus on her drink, but her curiosity got the best of her. "So, do you always look at people like that?" she asked, her voice quieter now, more curious than before. "Like you're trying to figure them out?" William's lips curled into a small smirk, his eyes never leaving hers. "Only when I think it's worth the effort." Her heart skipped a beat. What was happening here? Was this just playful banter, or was there something more? She couldn't tell, but the connection, whatever it was undeniable. Trying to steady her nerves, she downed the rest of her whiskey in one go. The burn of the alcohol was sharp, but it didn't quite erase the feeling that had settled in her chest. "This was fun," she said, her voice a little steadier, "but I have to get back to the bride." William didn't try to stop her. He simply watched her, his gaze fixed on her with that calm, calculating intensity she'd come to associate with him. "See you around, Jessica," he said softly, his voice low but leaving an impression. She hesitated, her hand already gripping the edge of her stool as she prepared to stand. Then, with a small smile, she turned back toward him. "See you around, Mr. Pfizer." As she walked away, her thoughts were racing. There was something about that conversation, something about the way he looked at her, that told her this wouldn't be their last encounter. The wedding continued around her, guests mingling and laughing, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had changed after that brief exchange. Something she couldn't quite define, but that made her heart beat a little faster than usual. She returned to the bridesmaids' table, grabbing a glass of champagne as an excuse to ground herself in the moment. But even as she took a sip, her eyes couldn't help but drift toward him. William was still watching her, his gaze unwavering. Clara appeared beside her with a teasing smile that seemed to carry a knowing look. "I saw you and the mysterious groomsman having an interesting moment at the bar," she said, her voice light with mischief. Jessica rolled her eyes, trying to dismiss the thought. "It was just casual conversation, nothing special." "Nothing special?" Clara raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "That man couldn't take his eyes off you during the ceremony, and now, even from across the room, he's still looking." Jessica let out a nervous laugh, taking a sip of her drink to buy herself a moment of composure. "You're exaggerating. He's just intriguing." "Intriguing," Clara chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Jessica, that man is one of the most powerful billionaires in the country, and from what people say, he doesn't get involved with anyone. If he's interested in you, it's because he sees something different." Jessica shrugged, her attempt to seem indifferent failing miserably as she felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "He just likes analyzing people, that's all. And honestly, I'm just an ordinary architect. There's no reason for someone like him to notice me." Clara sighed dramatically and shook her head. "Oh, Jessica, you really don't see it, do you?" Before Jessica could respond, one of the groomsmen came over, asking Clara to dance, leaving her alone again, but only for a moment. "Are you going to keep pretending you haven't noticed we've been looking at each other for hours?" came a deep, calm voice from behind her. Jessica closed her eyes for a second, gathering herself before slowly turning around. There, standing too close for comfort, was William. She swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "I wasn't looking at you," she said quickly, striving for a casual tone, hoping to downplay the undeniable tension between them. William tilted his head ever so slightly, his piercing gaze studying her with an intensity that made her heart race, sending an almost magnetic pull through her chest. "You're really bad at lying, aren't you?" Jessica crossed her arms defensively, trying to hide the sudden nervous flutter in her stomach. She let out a sarcastic laugh, trying to shield herself from the awkwardness. "And are you always like this, or do you just enjoy making people uncomfortable?" A small smile tugged at the corner of William's mouth, that ever so faint hint of amusement still present in his eyes. "I like to observe, to understand how people react, and so far you've been an interesting surprise." "Good for you," Jessica said with a dismissive wave, hoping to end the conversation. "Now, if you'll excuse me." Before she could move away, William's hand gently wrapped around her wrist, not enough to be forceful, but enough to stop her in her tracks. "Dance with me?" Jessica's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? One dance? That's all?" Her pulse quickened, and she stood there for a moment, caught between her own resistance and the unexpected allure of his presence. Everything in her screamed to refuse, to turn and walk away, but something about his gaze, the quiet challenge, the stillness of his voice, made it hard to ignore the pull. She hesitated for another moment, weighing her options, but all she could hear was the rhythmic beating of her own heart, louder than anything else. It was as though fate had already decided for her, and all she could do was follow. She glanced at the dance floor, where couples moved gracefully to the soft music, their bodies swaying in perfect harmony. Then, reluctantly, she turned back to him. "And what if I say no?" she asked, her voice tinged with defiance. William raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into that confident smirk that made her heart beat just a little faster. "I'd say you're lying again." Jessica bit her lower lip, her attempts at maintaining composure faltering as a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. "You're unbearably arrogant, you know that?" He took a deliberate step back, extending his hand with a calm, almost teasing expression. "And yet here you are, still considering my offer." Jessica exhaled sharply, a quiet internal battle raging inside her. What harm could it do? One dance, just one. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth of his touch and the solid strength in his grip. As he guided her to the dance floor, a strange sensation washed over her, as if the rest of the world had faded into the background, leaving only the two of them in that moment. His arm settled around her waist with quiet authority, and his firm hand wrapped around hers, anchoring her in a way that was both reassuring and unsettling. "You've done this before," Jessica remarked, trying her best to ignore how his presence seemed to dominate the space around them. "Dance?" He shrugged, his tone casual, but still carrying that edge of mystery. "A few times, but not like this." Jessica lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes up close. The intensity in his blue eyes seemed to draw her in, making her pulse quicken. "And what's different this time?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he answered, his voice low and steady. "You." A chill ran through Jessica's skin at his words, as if his simple declaration had shifted something in the air between them. She couldn't quite place what it was, but the weight of his words lingered in her chest. The room was bustling, full of chatter and movement, yet in that moment, it felt as if it were just the two of them. The rest of the world had faded into a blur, leaving only the rhythm of their steps and the unspoken tension building between them. For the first time that night, Jessica allowed herself to stop avoiding his gaze, and as their eyes locked, a wave of realization washed over her. Deep down, she knew something was happening, something that couldn't be ignored. And maybe, just maybe, she didn't want to. Jessica wasn't sure what was happening between them, but one thing was undeniable. There was no going back now. Well, she knew she was dancing with William Pfizer, the most reserved, intimidating, and apparently persistent man she'd ever met. Yet despite all of that, something felt different. There was an inexplicable ease in his presence, a kind of calmness that wrapped around her like a second skin. The ballroom was buzzing with activity, the sound of laughter, conversation, and the gentle clink of glasses. But as they moved together across the floor, everything else seemed to fade away. It was just her and William, gliding with effortless precision, as if they had been dancing together for years. Jessica realized with a start that she was enjoying herself more than she had expected. She had never paid much attention to dancing before, but now, In the warmth of his grip and the rhythm of their steps, she couldn't help but feel a sense of freedom, a lightness she hadn't anticipated. Or maybe it was just the fact that William seemed to know exactly how to guide her, how to hold her hand just firmly enough, how to touch her waist with a sense of control that didn't feel overbearing. Every movement was fluid, effortless, as though he had done this 1,000 times. "You're surprised," William's deep voice broke through the quiet hum of the ballroom, his words sending a shiver down her spine as they brushed against her ear. "Should I be?" she replied, her voice betraying a hint of amusement. "You didn't expect me to know how to dance?" Jessica raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "No, I didn't. But I guess it makes sense. I bet you learned this the same way you learned everything else in life, because you needed to keep up appearances." William's lips curled into a smirk, and his eyes sparkled with something unreadable. "Are you always this direct?" "Only when I'm curious," she replied, meeting his gaze with a defiant edge. His eyes, those piercing blue eyes, didn't leave hers. He seemed to study her, as if trying to peel back layers she wasn't ready to reveal. "Then tell me, Jessica, what else makes you curious?" For a moment, Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but the intensity of his gaze threw her completely off balance. She forgot the words she had been about to say, caught in the pull of his silent scrutiny. "That's not fair," she finally managed, her voice a little breathless. "What isn't?" he asked, his tone laced with amusement. "You distracting me with those eyes, and expecting me to form a coherent sentence," she quipped, shaking her head in exasperation. William let out a low chuckle, the sound rich and warm, resonating deep in her chest. "It's not my fault you get distracted so easily." Her heart skipped a beat at the way he said it, that knowing edge to his voice. For the briefest moment she wondered just how much he had seen of her, how much he had already figured out. And despite herself, she felt a strange, undeniable pull toward him, a curiosity she didn't know how to quench. She sighed, frustration creeping into her chest, and decided it was time to step away. But just as she shifted back, William's hand closed around hers. "Already running away?" he asked, his voice smooth with that hint of challenge. Jessica raised an eyebrow, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. "I don't run away." William studied her with that inscrutable gaze, his eyes piercing yet curious. "Then prove it." Crossing her arms defensively, she shot back, "How?" He paused, a fleeting moment of uncertainty crossing his face before he spoke again. "Meet me for coffee tomorrow." The proposition hung in the air, tempting but risky. She was drawn to the idea, but at the same time, a small part of her knew this could lead to complications. Luckily, just as the moment stretched uncomfortably, the music ended. She took a step back, brushing off the tension as if nothing had happened, putting distance between them. William stood still, watching her, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. As the party wound down, guests began filtering out. The bride and groom were occupied with their final round of well-wishers, and Jessica felt the weight of the long day on her shoulders. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess, and she felt it was time to head home. She made her way toward the hotel entrance, where the guest parking lot was. Her phone was already out, ready to summon a ride, but her frown deepened as a notification appeared. No drivers available at the moment. Great, just great. She considered waiting a little longer, but before she could even make a decision, she heard a voice behind her, familiar, calm, and a little too knowing. "Looks like your escape plan failed." Slowly she turned around and saw William Fisher standing there, hands casually tucked into his suit pockets, his sharp eyes trained on her with that unsettling, almost predatory gaze. "I'm not running away, I'm just going home," she replied, trying to sound casual. "Without a ride." "That's just a detail," he said, his tone almost too confident. William tilted his head slightly, studying the situation as if it were just another problem to solve. Then, without missing a beat, he added, "I'll take you." Jessica blinked, not sure if she had heard him right. "You what?" "I'll drive you home," he repeated, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "It's late, and I don't think it's safe for a woman to be waiting alone at this hour." She crossed her arms, unwilling to admit the truth of his words. "I can take care of myself." "I never said you couldn't," he replied smoothly. "But why wait? When I'm already leaving?" Jessica hesitated, her thoughts whirling as she weighed her options. What could one more night of conversation with William Fisher hurt? Accepting a ride from William felt wrong for so many reasons. First, being stuck in a car with him meant there would be no escape from his teasing, which she knew would only make her more irritated. Second, there was something about him, a subtle intensity, that made her heart race in a way she couldn't quite explain. She glanced at the app again, half hoping a driver would magically appear, but the screen stayed unchanged, mocking her inability to escape. "Fine," she finally muttered, defeated, "but only because I have no other option." William didn't say a word. He just opened the car door and stood there, waiting for her to climb in. Jessica hesitated, but finally took a deep breath and slid into the passenger seat. As soon as the door closed behind her, the car seemed to close in with the weight of an uncomfortable silence. The city lights flickered past the windows as they drove, their glow reflecting off the sleek interior of the car. Jessica fidgeted, her fingers twisting around the hem of her dress, unsure whether she should say something to fill the void or simply let the silence linger. William, on the other hand, seemed completely at ease, his focus on the road ahead, unfazed by the tension. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. "Do you always drive alone?" she asked, hoping the small talk would help break the ice. He glanced at her briefly, his expression unreadable, before responding, "I like driving at night. Helps me think." "Oh, so you do think," she teased, raising an eyebrow, trying to keep the conversation light. William's lips twitched into a small, fleeting smile, one that made her stomach flutter in spite of herself. "You don't think I do?" "I think you're a mystery," she said, with a hint of sarcasm. He didn't seem bothered by it. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his seat, his fingers relaxed on the wheel. "And does that bother you?" Jessica hesitated for just a moment before answering, her voice quieter. "I think so." "Why?" he pressed, his tone surprisingly gentle. "Because you have this intimidating energy," she said, words coming out in a rush as she tried to explain, "like you're always in control, like nothing ever shakes you." William was silent for a moment, as though contemplating her words. The soft hum of the car was the only sound in the space between them. Finally, without looking at her, his voice took on a different, almost introspective tone. Calmly, "You have no idea the effect you have on people." Jessica's eyes widened as she turned toward him, stunned by his bluntness. "What?" He didn't answer immediately, but she could see the ghost of a smile tug at the corner of his lips, that same quiet smirk that had been both infuriating and strangely magnetic since the first time they'd met. His fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel as he spoke again, his voice low but deliberate. "You talk as if I'm the only hard-to-read person in this conversation, but, Jessica," he continued, his gaze steady on the road, "I don't think you realize how much you draw people's attention." Her chest tightened. She looked away quickly, trying to mask the sudden flutter of something unfamiliar taking root there. It was just a casual comment, she told herself. Or maybe it wasn't. The car stopped at a red light, and for the first time William turned his head toward her fully, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race again. "You feel uncomfortable around me," he said, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful, "because you think I analyze you too much. But the truth is, you intrigue me. And I like understanding the things that intrigue me." Jessica couldn't respond right away. She just stared at him, her mind spinning, unable to figure out whether she was annoyed or captivated, maybe a little bit of both. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but the words never came. She wasn't sure whether to be annoyed by his boldness or oddly flattered by it. The rest of the drive to her apartment was quiet, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence where each of them seemed lost in their own thoughts, quietly processing everything that had just unfolded between them. When William finally pulled up in front of her building, Jessica couldn't help but let out a small sigh of relief. She was grateful to finally be home, but there was an odd feeling in her chest, one that lingered. Something had shifted between them that night, something she couldn't quite define. She turned toward him, feeling an inexplicable need to say something before she left. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice softer than she intended. William tilted his head slightly, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "It was my pleasure, Jessica." Her chest tightened as she caught the underlying meaning in his tone. A shiver ran down her spine, and, for a brief moment, she wondered if she had imagined it. Not wanting to linger in the charged atmosphere, She opened the car door and stepped out, making sure to close it gently behind her. The night air hit her, but it did little to cool the heat building inside her. As she climbed the steps to the entrance of her building, she couldn't help but glance back, an overwhelming compulsion pulling at her. To her surprise, William was still there, watching her, his figure illuminated by the soft streetlights. Her heart skipped a beat. Quickly, she turned away and hurried inside. The moment the elevator doors closed behind her, Jessica leaned against the cool metal wall, her mind racing. She let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. What had just happened? The next morning, Jessica walked into the construction firm's office, juggling a cup of coffee in one hand and a few reports in the other. After a weekend spent trying not to think about William Fisher, she was determined to get back to her normal routine. But despite her best efforts, something inside her felt off, restless. She had convinced herself she would never see him again. After all, he was a billionaire CEO mingling in high-profile circles of investors and boardroom meetings, while she was just an architect, deeply focused on her work. Their worlds had no reason to intersect again. At least that's what she thought. Jessica stepped into the conference room, carrying her project folder in one hand and coffee in the other. Her colleagues were already chatting casually, while Oliver Harris, the firm's director, flipped through pages about the Richmond Tower, an ambitious project that had the potential to change the city's skyline. Taking her usual seat, Jessica settled in for another one of those long technical meetings, the kind where every detail was dissected and she could easily lose herself in the work. But as soon as she lifted her eyes to glance around the room, her heart dropped. William Fisher. He was sitting at the head of the table, his flawless suit and calm demeanor making it clear that this was just another business deal for him. He scanned the documents in front of him with the same serious, analytical gaze she had seen the night of the wedding. Jessica froze. No, this cannot be happening. As if he could sense her presence, William slowly lifted his eyes and met hers. For a brief moment, everything else faded away, and it felt as if time had stopped. The air in the room grew thicker, more charged, as their gazes locked. To her utter shock, William remained composed and greeted her in a cool, professional tone. "Miss Carter." Jessica blinked, nearly dropping her coffee in surprise. Is he pretending this is normal? Noticing the awkward silence that had settled in, Oliver quickly stepped in to break the tension. "Jessica, this is William Fisher, our new lead investor for the Richmond Tower project." Her stomach twisted in disbelief. What was happening? Mr. Fisher and his investment firm have acquired a stake in the project's funding. He'll be our strategic partner moving forward. Jessica's gaze shifted from William to Oliver and then to her colleagues, only to realize that no one else seemed to be reacting the way she was. No one except her. William remained silent, his presence calm and collected, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. He didn't speak, he simply observed her, allowing her to process the bombshell he had dropped. Jessica inhaled deeply, forcing herself to regain control. She pasted a professional smile on her face. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Fisher." "Thank you," William replied smoothly, his lips curving into a slight smile, but his eyes, they told a different story, one that sent an unfamiliar shiver down her spine. After the meeting, Jessica was determined to escape the office as quickly as possible. She needed air. She needed a moment to process the whirlwind of events that had just unfolded. But of course, William Fisher wasn't going to let her slip away that easily. She had barely made it out of the conference room when she heard his voice behind her, smooth and deliberate. "Jessica!" She closed her eyes for a second, letting the exhaustion of the situation wash over her, before slowly turning around. "What is it?" William was standing there, arms crossed, his posture as commanding as ever. His perfectly tailored suit only heightened the air of effortless power he exuded. "No friendlier greeting?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. She scoffed, folding her arms in response. "Are you my boss now?" "Not exactly," he said, his gaze never leaving her. "But we'll have to work together." Her heart skipped a beat, her throat suddenly dry. "Did you already know?" William tilted his head, his eyes glinting with a touch of amusement. "I found out the moment I saw your name on the project team." "And you didn't think that would be awkward?" she shot back. "I thought it would be interesting," he replied, a slight smile tugging at his lips. Jessica let out a disbelieving laugh. "Oh, so now fate is a game to you?" "I'd say fate has a peculiar sense of humor," he answered smoothly, his voice almost too calm. She narrowed her eyes. "Or maybe you manipulated it." William smiled slowly, a knowing look in his eyes. "You're giving me too much credit, Jessica." Jessica wasn't sure if she wanted to run away or throw her coffee at him. The temptation to do both was strong. But one thing was certain, there was no escaping this situation now. The Horizon construction office was eerily quiet, save for the soft clicking of keys and the occasional rustling of papers. Jessica sat at her desk, pretending to focus on the stack of documents in front of her. She was doing everything she could to ignore the presence of William Fisher, who was perched in a chair across the meeting room, casually watching her. The realization had hit her like a ton of bricks earlier that day. William Fisher was one of the primary investors in the Richmond Tower project. That meant she was now stuck working with him closely over the next several months, and judging by the way he was lounging in his seat, he was enjoying this far too much. "Do you always frown like that when you're focused?" His voice broke the silence, pulling her out of her thoughts. Jessica gritted her teeth, keeping her gaze fixed on the papers. "Do you always ask random questions when you should be working?" William's lips curved upward, a subtle smile playing on his face. "Only when I'm trying to understand someone." She raised an eyebrow, her suspicions rising. "And why do you want to understand me?" He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, his eyes never leaving hers. That intense gaze, the one that seemed to penetrate her very thoughts, made her stomach flip. "Because you intrigue me, Jessica." She froze. The sudden heat in her face told her all she needed to know. She quickly averted her eyes, pretending to inspect the papers in front of her, though her mind was far from focused. But William wasn't done yet. "Let's go to dinner," he said casually, as if it were the most natural suggestion. Jessica blinked, confused. "What?" "We need to go over the project details. It'll be more productive than staying late at the office." She tilted her head, narrowing her eyes. "So, this isn't really an invitation, it's just a way to make me work overtime." "If that makes it easier to accept, then yes," he replied with a teasing tone. Jessica let out a resigned sigh. She knew she didn't have much choice in the matter, but she also wasn't about to let him think she was completely at his mercy. "Fine, but I get to pick the restaurant." William's smile deepened. And for some reason, it made something flutter in her chest, something she couldn't quite place. Better? The restaurant was small and cozy, a stark contrast to the high-end, exclusive spots Jessica imagined William typically frequented. The soft glow of the ambient lights and the smell of fresh food gave the place a homey, inviting feel. "You really brought me to a place this simple?" William's voice held a touch of amusement as he surveyed the modest decor. "I'm a woman of simple tastes, Mr. Fisher," Jessica replied, a playful smile tugging at the corners of her lips. He chuckled, glancing at the menu. "And you think a CEO like me wouldn't enjoy this?" Jessica leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms casually. "I think CEOs like you only know menus with unpronounceable names and dishes that cost half my salary." William raised an eyebrow, a mischievous glint in his eye. "You might be right. But it's always good to try new things." Jessica shook her head, laughing softly. "If you still say that after tasting the food here, then I'll believe you." As they placed their orders, Jessica noticed something unusual. For the first time since they started working together, William seemed more at ease. The usual tension between them remained, but there was an unspoken shift, a subtle relaxation in his posture, the way he spoke with less formality. It was almost as if he was truly enjoying the moment. "Now tell me," he began, leaning forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "Why architecture?" Jessica hesitated, taking a sip of her drink before responding. "What do you mean? Was this always your dream?" William's gaze was steady, sincere, almost like he genuinely wanted to understand her. She shrugged, her expression softening as she thought about the long path that led her here. "Since I was a kid, I always liked creating things, transforming spaces. Architecture gives me the chance to change people's lives." William nodded, as if absorbing her words. He leaned back, studying her with a quiet interest. "And have you?" A small smile tugged at Jessica's lips as she remembered one of her first projects. There was a client once, an elderly woman who wanted to remodel her home to accommodate her grandson, who had been in an accident and was now paralyzed. When we finished the project, she cried. She said it would change his life. William sat in silence for a moment, his expression softening. "That's admirable," he said quietly, the tone of his voice a little different than usual. There was something uncharacteristically warm about the way he spoke. For the briefest of moments, Jessica could have sworn she saw a glimpse of something genuine behind his often guarded eyes. She laughed softly, a slight shake of her head. "Don't compliment me like that, Mr. Fisher. I'm used to you challenging me at work. Maybe I just like seeing you annoyed," he teased, his eyes gleaming with a playful challenge. Jessica felt her face warm, a mixture of frustration and something else swirling within her. "You're impossible. And yet you're still here," he replied, his voice low, as if the statement carried more weight than just the words themselves. Before she could respond, the waiter arrived with their food, breaking the tension and offering a brief moment of reprieve. Jessica quickly grabbed her utensils, trying to focus on the plate in front of her, but her mind kept drifting back to his words. She was still there, and if she were honest with herself, she was enjoying it more than she should. Hours later, as the evening stretched into night, Jessica and William stepped out of the cozy restaurant. The city lights cast a soft glow on the streets, their reflections shimmering on the wet pavement from a recent rain. The cool night air, refreshing and crisp, offered a welcome contrast to the warmth they'd just left behind inside. "Are you sleepy?" William asked casually as they walked toward the car parked nearby. Jessica shook her head. "Not really, but if you're planning to take me back to the office, I'll pretend I am." A soft laugh escaped William's lips, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "Not at all. It's a beautiful night. Why don't we take a walk instead?" She raised an eyebrow, skeptically eyeing him. William Fisher, wandering around aimlessly? That's new. He shot her a playful smile. "You did say it's good to try new things." Jessica rolled her eyes but found herself unable to refuse. "All right, I'll bite." They walked side by side, their footsteps echoing softly on the quiet streets. There was no rush, no agenda, just the city, the night, and the two of them moving together through it. The gentle breeze ruffled Jessica's hair as they strolled, and the hum of distant traffic was the only sound breaking the silence. She couldn't help but notice how different William seemed tonight. There was no air of control, no wall of cold professionalism between them. It was as if the man she thought she knew, the distant, calculating CEO, had vanished, replaced by someone who could, for once, just be present. "Have you always been like this?" she asked, her curiosity getting the best of her. "You know, reserved?" William's expression softened, his gaze focused on the path ahead of them. For a moment, it seemed like he was searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "Life has taught me to be cautious, but that doesn't mean I don't feel anything." The answer took Jessica by surprise. She wasn't expecting him to open up, let alone say something so raw. She glanced at him, wondering if she had misjudged him all along, and that's when it hit her. William Fisher was more complicated than she had ever given him credit for. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it felt reflective, like the weight of his words lingered between them. The city around them continued to move, the world carrying on without them, but in that moment, it felt like time had slowed. For the first time, Jessica saw him, really saw him, as a person, not just a businessman. And she wasn't sure if she liked it. This was dangerous. As she woke up the following morning, Jessica couldn't shake the lingering thoughts from the night before, the dinner, the unexpected ease of their conversation, and, most troubling of all, the strange enjoyment she'd found in being around William. It wasn't supposed to feel that way, she wasn't supposed to be drawn to him, but she had been, and that thought unsettled her deeply. With a quick, determined movement, she pulled herself from bed and went through her morning routine. Work, she told herself. Focus on the Richmond Tower project. Keep your distance from William. But as soon as she entered the Horizon construction office, she knew that wouldn't be so easy. There, sitting at the head of the conference table, was William. His posture was as composed as ever, his gaze calm and focused on the papers in front of him as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened between them the night before. Jessica hesitated at the door, feeling a sudden knot form in her stomach. With a deep breath, she pushed forward, forcing herself to step inside. "Good morning," she greeted him, trying to muster a formality she didn't feel. William glanced up at her, offering a small but knowing smile. "Good morning, Jessica. Did you sleep well?" Her jaw clenched. How could he be so calm, so unaffected? He knew exactly what he was doing. "Perfectly," Jessica replied, her voice as neutral as she could manage, though inside, she felt the subtle tension building between them. William nodded, a slight smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, clearly amused by her composed response. The rest of the team began trickling in, and the meeting started, but Jessica couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. She forced herself to focus on the technical aspects of the project, the structural adjustments in the budget, but it was impossible to block out William's presence. Every so often, she felt his eyes on her. The weight of his gaze was subtle but undeniable, and each time it happened, a rush of warmth shot through her, causing her heartbeat to quicken. She kept her face impassive, determined not to let him see that he had any effect on her. The meeting stretched on for what felt like an eternity, an hour filled with intense discussions and technical jargon that Jessica usually found comfortable. But today, the words seemed to blur together as she tried and failed to ignore the tension in the room. As the meeting came to an end, the team began to file out, and Jessica quickly gathered her notes. She was eager to leave, to get out of the suffocating atmosphere that seemed to hang around William. She could almost feel his presence in the air, like a magnetic pole that drew her in despite her efforts to keep a safe distance. Just as she turned toward the door, she heard him call out her name. "Jessica!" Her body stiffened for a moment, but she forced herself to exhale and maintain her calm demeanor. She turned to face him, hiding the fleeting panic that had surged through her chest. "Yes?" William had already closed his folder and was standing up, adjusting his jacket with the casual confidence that made her stomach tighten. "I need to discuss a few project decisions with you." Jessica kept her expression neutral, though she could feel her heart pounding. This was work, just work. She had to remember that. "Okay, can we do it now?" she asked, trying to sound as indifferent as possible. "Of course," he replied smoothly, picking up his coffee cup. He gestured toward her to follow him, and without another word, they walked together to the office balcony, an open, quiet space often used for informal meetings. As they stepped outside, the warm morning sun bathed the city in golden light, casting long shadows over the bustling streets below. The contrast between the peaceful setting and the tension that seemed to cling to the air between them couldn't have been more stark. Jessica leaned against the railing, crossing her arms defensively, unwilling to let him see how much the simple act of sharing this space with him affected her. "So, what exactly do you want to talk about?" she asked, her tone cool, her eyes fixed firmly on the horizon. William studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing. His silence stretched on for a heartbeat longer than comfortable before he answered. "Last night." The words were enough to make Jessica's body tense. Her pulse quickened, and she immediately locked her gaze with his, trying to steady herself. "Last night?" she echoed, her voice a little sharper than intended. "Yes," William replied, his eyes narrowing slightly, watching her closely, almost as though he were reading her every reaction. Jessica's gaze flickered for a moment before she narrowed her eyes, trying to keep the irritation in check. "I thought we were here to talk about the project," she said, her tone firm, unwilling to let him steer the conversation in a direction she wasn't prepared for. William leaned back slightly, that small, dangerously charming smile of his curling at the edges of his lips. "We can talk about both," he suggested smoothly, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She huffed in frustration, crossing her arms tighter over her chest. "Look, William, what happened last night was a work dinner, that's all," she said, her words cutting the air between them, firm and resolute. His smile didn't falter, but his eyes darkened with a hint of something more intense, more knowing. "Are you sure?" The question caught her off guard. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but something in his expression made her hesitate. Something in the way he watched her that made her feel exposed. She wasn't sure, not anymore, and he knew it. The realization made her uncomfortable, her insides twisting into knots, and before she could give into whatever pull was forming between them, she decided to cut the conversation short. "I have to go," she said briskly, turning on her heel and walking away from the balcony's edge. But just as she started to move, William's voice stopped her in her tracks. "You're pulling away on purpose." A chill ran down her spine at his words, his calm tone carrying an undercurrent of certainty that unsettled her more than she cared to admit. She paused, her back still to him, but she didn't turn around. "This has nothing to do with you," she muttered, trying to convince herself more than him. "Yes, it does." Her annoyance flared as she spun around to face him, her jaw clenched. "Why do you think everything revolves around you?" He took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them with an ease that made her heart beat faster. His presence was almost overpowering now, filling the space around them like an electric charge. The air felt thicker, heavier. "Because I know this game, Jessica." The words were a challenge, a quiet admission, and the way he said them made her wonder just how much he had already figured out. How much of this had he been aware of all along? She held her breath, her chest tightening as she stared at him, her mind racing to find the right words, the right defense. "And what game is that?" she asked, her voice steady but her heart pounding in her ears. William's eyes glinted with knowing, a quiet confidence in his every movement as he took a step closer, his presence unshakable. "The game of distance," he said, his voice low and unyielding. "You're pushing me away because you feel something you don't want to admit." Jessica's stomach churned at his words, an unsettling feeling spreading through her veins, but she couldn't let him see how much he was getting to her. "You're completely wrong," she spat, her voice a little too sharp, but it was the only defense she had left. William didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if dissecting every small shift in her posture, every twitch of her expression. "Then look me in the eye and tell me you didn't feel anything last night." Her throat went dry. She wanted to deny it, to push back against the heat rising in her chest, to tell him it had been nothing, just a momentary lapse. But the words wouldn't come. She couldn't lie, not to him and not to herself. And deep down she knew that he knew the truth too. The silence between them stretched out, thick and suffocating, filled with all the things neither of them was willing to acknowledge. It hung in the air, unspoken but so loud that it drowned out everything else. Finally, Jessica broke the stillness, stepping back, her mind racing, her hands trembling slightly. "This doesn't matter," she said, her voice more clipped than before. "I have work to do." With that, she turned on her heel and walked away, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind fighting against the nagging feeling that William's words had hit too close to home. But as she moved down the hallway, she could feel it, the weight in her chest that grew heavier with every step she took. She knew, deep down, that she couldn't outrun this. Sooner or later, she wouldn't be able to escape whatever had started between them. And that realization left her feeling more exposed than she ever cared to admit. Jessica spent the remainder of the day trying to push the conversation with William from her mind, attempting to convince herself that he was wrong, that she didn't feel anything. At least, that's what she kept telling herself, over and over, like a mantra meant to suppress the undeniable truth that was clawing at her chest. But as the hours passed, ignoring the truth became a battle she couldn't win. The tension had been there long before their conversation on the balcony, growing steadily since Clara's wedding. At first, Jessica had brushed it off, just a bit of harmless teasing, a back-and-forth game of provocations that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. But now everything had shifted. She couldn't ignore it any longer. His presence unsettled her in a way she could no longer deny, and deep down, she knew William was well aware of it. By the end of the workday, Jessica was exhausted, both mentally and emotionally. She gathered her things and made her way to the office kitchen, needing a moment to breathe before going home. As she filled a glass with water, she leaned against the counter, letting her eyes flutter shut for a few seconds, trying to calm the storm in her mind. That's when she felt it, an unmistakable presence beside her. Without opening her eyes, she knew exactly who it was. "You're avoiding me again," William's voice came low, controlled, but with an undercurrent of something else, something deeper, something that made her pulse race. Jessica exhaled slowly, bracing herself before turning to face him. "I'm not avoiding you. I'm just trying to work without distractions." He raised an eyebrow, a slow smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "So, now I'm a distraction?" Jessica didn't flinch. "You always have been." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and the instant she realized what she had said, her cheeks flushed warm with embarrassment. But William didn't react the way she expected. Instead, he simply gave her a knowing look, as if he'd been anticipating that response all along. "Finally," he said, his voice dipping even lower, laced with a quiet satisfaction. Jessica's arms crossed instinctively, the cold edge of her defense creeping in. "Finally what?" "Finally admitting it," William replied, his gaze intense, never leaving hers. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Frustration built inside her as she looked away, her gaze fixed on the floor. "I'm not admitting anything." "Yes, you are," he said, stepping closer, his presence enveloping her, making the air around them feel thicker, warmer. "Jessica, you can keep pretending this isn't happening, but we both know it is." She swallowed hard, her breath catching in her throat. The weight of his words hung between them, the undeniable truth that had been there all along, creeping closer, wrapping around her like an invisible thread. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to fight it anymore. "You want to know what's happening, William? I don't have time for this," Jessica snapped, trying to push him away with words that sounded more uncertain than she wanted them to. He didn't look surprised. He simply studied her with that intense, unwavering gaze, as if he could see straight through her. After a beat, he responded, his voice calm and sure. "You have time for everything except admitting how you feel." Jessica closed her eyes for a brief moment, fighting the swell of emotions threatening to break through. This was a dangerous game, a game she knew she couldn't afford to lose. "This can't happen," she said, her voice firm, though she knew it lacked conviction. "Why not?" William's question was simple, but the weight behind it made her heart skip. She opened her eyes and met his gaze, his unwavering, steady gaze. "Because we worked together." William's smile was slow, almost predatory, like a man who knew he was about to win a game. And in that moment, Jessica knew he wasn't going to give up. Not easily, anyway. "Easily? And what if we didn't?" His voice dropped lower, becoming almost a whisper, and yet it felt like a declaration. Jessica's breath caught, her pulse quickening as he closed the distance between them, leaning in just enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, like the air before a storm. "Tell me, Jessica," he said, his voice thick with something dangerously alluring. "If I weren't your investor, if you weren't so caught up in these rules and boundaries, what would you do?" The question hung in the air, and for a moment Jessica couldn't answer. She couldn't speak, couldn't think clearly, because deep down she already knew the answer. And so did William. The silence between them stretched, thick with an undeniable tension that neither of them could escape. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, and yet neither of them moved. Finally, Jessica broke the moment, stepping back, putting physical distance between them. "I have to go," she said, her voice tinged with finality. William didn't stop her. He simply watched her with that same knowing look, as if he already knew what was coming next. The moment Jessica stepped through the door and out of his presence, she felt it, the weight of it, the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. The next day, Jessica did her best to stick to her usual routine, trying to put the conversation with William behind her. She walked into Horizon Construction with her usual air of composure, but the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. The weight of the unspoken tension between them hung heavily in the air, thick and undeniable. Every glance, every word exchanged in passing seemed charged with something that had been simmering just beneath the surface for too long. Jessica tried to push it out of her mind, burying herself in the technicalities of the Richmond Tower project, but every now and then she would feel the familiar prickle of his presence. It was as if he was always there, watching, waiting. And she knew deep down that sooner or later she would have to make a decision. But what kind of decision? She wasn't sure. There was a voice inside her that wanted to let it happen, wanted to give in to whatever it was between them. But that voice was quickly drowned out by reason, by the cold, hard reality of her situation. Working with William Fisher was already complicated enough. Any involvement between them, no matter how innocent or fleeting, would lead to a minefield of issues. Professionalism, ethics, reputation. There was too much at stake for her to even entertain the thought of crossing that line. So she made up her mind. Keeping her distance was the only option. It wasn't just the safe choice. It was the only choice. But what she didn't expect was how relentless William would be in proving her wrong. He wasn't the kind of man who took no easily, and Jessica knew that the battle between them wasn't over. It had only just begun. It was nearly midnight when Jessica finally managed to disconnect from work. After poring over the blueprints for the Richmond Tower project one last time, she shut down her laptop, feeling the weight of the day in every tired muscle. She took a quick shower to wash away the tension, then collapsed onto the couch, her body craving rest. But her mind, it was a mess. Every thought, every lingering moment with William swirled in her head like a storm she couldn't quite escape. She needed a distraction, anything to take her mind off the tension, off the chaos of everything that had happened over the past few days. Then her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She reached for it, expecting some random notification, maybe a reminder or an update from a colleague. But when she saw the name on the screen, her heart skipped a beat. William Fisher. Her finger hovered over the screen, hesitation gnawing at her. A part of her wanted to ignore it, just put the phone down and go to sleep. But the other part of her, the part that had been unraveling since that first dinner, couldn't resist. She needed to know what he wanted. She needed to know if this was just another game or if something else was happening. With a deep breath, she opened the message. "William, I need to talk to you. It's important." Her throat went dry as she stared at the words, the weight of them sinking in. She knew this conversation wasn't going to be easy, whatever it was about. "Jessica, is this about the project?" There was a long pause before his reply came through. "William." "No." Her pulse quickened. "No? Then what could it possibly be about?" "Jessica." "Then it can wait until tomorrow." She locked her phone before he could reply, needing to create some distance between herself and the emotions she was already battling. She leaned her head against the back of the couch, feeling the exhaustion press down on her chest. But deep down, she knew this wouldn't be the end, not by a long shot. And she was right. Jessica thought she could outrun the pull, but fate clearly has other plans. William Fisher isn't just a distraction. He's a challenge, a temptation, and maybe something more. But with their professional worlds now colliding, can Jessica truly keep her distance? Or is she already in too deep? What do you think will happen next? Will Jessica give in to the undeniable tension, or will she push William away before things get even more complicated? Drop your predictions in the comments below, and if you're hooked, don't worry, part 2 is coming soon. Make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. See you soon for the next chapter.